In the winter of 1886, a young woman in Michigan inherited a stone cabin that everyone said was worthless. And what she found beneath the floor saved more lives than anyone could have predicted. But before we get to that winter, before the snow and the silence and the things buried underground, we need to go back to a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1879 when Wren Pemberton was 16 years old and her mother came home with mud on her hands. Cora Pemberton walked through the back door of the family house outside Traverse City just as the light was turning gold through the kitchen windows. Her dress was filthy from the waist down. Her boots left tracks on the clean floor. Mud caked her fingers all the way to the elbows, and her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in damp strands around her face. She looked like a woman who had been digging a grave. Delphine, the eldest daughter at 24, was setting the table for supper. She looked up and said, "Where on earth have you been?" Cora hung her coat on the hook by the door and said, "Picking mushrooms." Delphine stared at the mud. Nobody picks mushrooms and comes home looking like they just crawled out of a ditch. Cora did not respond. She walked to the basin, poured water from the pitcher, and began washing her hands with the slow deliberation of someone who had done hard work and was not ashamed of it. Delphine watched her for another moment, then shook her head and went back to the silverware. But later that evening, when the dishes were done and Delphine and Marin had gone to bed, Wren found her mother sitting alone on the back step, looking out at the darkening tree line. Wren sat beside her without being asked. They had always been like that, the two of them, comfortable in the same silence. After a long while, Cora spoke without turning her head. "There are things I am building that I cannot explain right now, but one day you will see. You are the only one who will see." Wren asked why. Cora said, "Because your sisters look at everything and see a price. You look and see what is actually there." Wren did not understand what that meant. Not then. She was 16 and her mother was the kind of woman who said strange things on summer evenings and never explained them further. Wren filed the words away in the back of her mind, the way you save a letter you cannot yet read, trusting that the language will make sense later. 7 years later, on the 4th of August, 1886, it did. Cora Pemberton died in her sleep in the back room of the family house. She went the same way she had done everything in her life, quietly, without asking anyone for permission or attention. By the time Wren arrived from the general store where she worked sweeping floors and stacking shelves, her two older sisters had already begun dividing the estate. The kitchen table had been cleared of everything except a sheet of paper and a pencil. Delphine, now 31, stood at the head of the table with the posture of a woman conducting a business acquisition. She had always carried herself that way, as though the world was an inventory to be managed, and she was the only one qualified to manage it. Marin, the middle sister, 27, sat beside her, nodding at every suggestion Delphine made, the way she had been nodding at Delphine's suggestions since childhood. Wren stood in the doorway in her work apron, still smelling of floor dust and dry goods, and listened. The family house went to Delphine. The 40 acres of cleared farmland along the river bottom went to Marin. The savings, what little remained after funeral costs, were to be split between the two of them. Delphine read each item from her list with the efficiency of someone who had already made all the decisions and was simply informing the others. Then she reached the last item and her voice changed. It softened into the kind of theatrical pity that was worse than open cruelty because it disguised contempt as compassion. Their mother had left Wren the deed to a one-room stone cabin on a rocky wooded lot 4 miles north of town. A place none of them had visited in years. A place their mother had occasionally disappeared to on weekends without explanation. Nobody wanted it. The lot was too rocky to farm. The cabin had no proper chimney. The roof leaked. The nearest well was a quarter-mile through dense birch and cedar. Delphine set the deed on the table in front of Wren and said she was sorry their mother had left her the worst of it. But perhaps she could sell the stones for foundation work. Marin laughed. She said Wren could always live in it if she wanted to freeze to death by Christmas. Wren looked at the deed on the table. Then she looked at Delphine. Did Mother leave anything else, a letter? Any other papers? Delphine met her eyes. There is nothing else. She died in her sleep, Wren. There is nothing dramatic here. But as she said it, Delphine's hand lay flat on the table, pressed down as though she were holding something beneath it. Wren noticed the hand. She noticed the pressure in those fingers. And she chose not to ask again. There are moments in a family when you learn more from what is not said than from what is. Wren had spent 23 years learning that lesson. She picked up the deed, folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and walked out. Outside, Ansel Stanhope was waiting by his wagon. Ansel owned the general store where Wren worked. He was a man of 50 who had built his business by understanding one principle above all others. Everything in the world had a price, and the person who knew that price first had the advantage. He gave Wren a ride back to the store every evening because it was on his way, and because even small kindnesses could be converted into leverage later. On the ride back, he asked what she had received. Wren told him about the cabin. Ansel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That lot sits on granite bedrock. You cannot plow it, you cannot build on it, but if you want to sell, I can find a buyer. Small commission for my trouble." Wren said no. Ansel did not press, but he narrowed his eyes the way he always did when he was filing away information for later use. He had a ledger in his head that tracked favors and debts the way other men tracked weather. Wren had just become an entry in that ledger, and she did not yet know it. The next morning, Wren borrowed a mule and cart from the store and rode 4 miles north along a rutted track that wound through birch forests and over granite ridges. The late summer air was warm but carried the faint metallic edge that meant autumn was already gathering itself in the upper atmosphere. Crickets sang in the tall grass along the roadside. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. The cabin was exactly as bad as she remembered from childhood. The walls were thick fieldstones solidly built by someone who understood how to lay rock. But the mortar between many of the upper stones had crumbled and fallen away, leaving gaps where wind and rain could enter. The plank door hung crooked on leather hinges that had dried and cracked. The roof was cedar shake, and a third of the shakes had blown off or rotted through, leaving dark holes open to the sky. Inside, the single room was dim and smelled of damp earth and old wood. The floor was rough-hewn planks laid directly on the ground, and many of them had warped and split over the years. A rusted iron stove sat in one corner with its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor. Wren walked around the outside of the cabin, first running her hand along the stone walls. The fieldstone had been gathered from the surface of the lot, granite and basalt, and the occasional piece of quartz that caught the afternoon light. Whoever had laid these walls had known what they were doing. The corners were square. The stones were graduated by size, largest at the base, smallest near the roofline. It was not the work of an amateur. Wren wondered if her mother had built this cabin too, or if it had been here when she bought the land. She did not know, and the not knowing added to the growing list of things about Cora Pemberton that had been invisible until now. The lot itself was 4 acres of rocky wooded ground that sloped gently upward from the track to a granite ridge at the north end. Cedar and birch grew thick across most of it, with a few old oaks scattered along the eastern boundary. A seasonal creek ran along the west side, dry now in August, but showing the smooth stones and cut banks of regular spring flow. The soil was thin, more rock than dirt, the kind of ground that broke plows and broke the spirits of the men who pushed them. No one in Leelanau County would have paid more than a few dollars for this lot, and most would not have paid that. But the cabin drew Wren back. She stood in the doorway and looked at it the way her mother had told her to look at things not for what they were worth, but for what they actually were. And what she saw was a solid shell with fixable problems. The walls were sound, the foundation was level. The roof needed shakes, but the rafters underneath were cedar, still strong, still fragrant, when she reached up and scratched one with her thumbnail. The door needed rehanging. The stove needed reconnecting. None of it was beyond repair. But standing in the middle of that room, Wren noticed something she had not expected. The smell was wrong, not wrong in the way of rot or neglect, wrong in the way of contradiction. Underneath the mustiness, she caught traces of something else. Fresh cut wood, beeswax, lime, faint old but unmistakable. Someone had been working in this cabin recently, more recently than years ago. And on the warped floorboards near the center of the room, she found dried mud in the shape of a woman's boot print. Her mother had been here, not years ago, recently. Wren stood still and let herself feel what the room was telling her. The air coming up through the gaps in the floorboards was not the cold damp of bare ground. It was mild, almost comfortable, like the air in a root cellar in spring. A steady, gentle warmth that had no business being there. She knelt and pressed her hand to the gap between two planks. Warm air moved upward against her palm like a slow breath. She pried up one board, then another, then a third. And what she found beneath made her sit back on her heels and press both hands over her mouth. Beneath the floor was not bare ground. There was a cellar, a deep one, stone-walled, carefully constructed, at least 8 feet deep and nearly as wide as the cabin itself. A wooden ladder leaned against the near wall, solidly built, waiting. Wren lowered herself down. The air wrapped around her as she descended, warmer with each rung. She stepped off the ladder onto a floor of flat stones fitted tightly together, the kind of careful work that takes months to do right. The walls were field stone, laid with even greater craftsmanship than the cabin above each stone selected, and placed with the precision of someone who understood that what you build underground must be stronger than what you build in the open, because underground there is no room for failure. She held her lantern up and turned slowly. Along the far wall, wooden shelves had been built into the stone, and on those shelves sat rows of sealed glass jars. Wren lifted one and held it to the lantern light. Preserved green beans, bright and impossible in the amber glow. Another held tomatoes. Another held apple butter, dark and rich. There were jars of pickled beets and corn relish and blackberry preserves, each one sealed with wax and labeled in her mother's careful handwriting with the contents and the date. The oldest jars were from 1881. 5 years. Her mother had been coming here for 5 years. 5 years of quiet weekend trips that everyone in the family had dismissed as the wanderings of a strange woman who preferred solitude to company. 5 years of work that no one had seen because no one had thought to look. Wren counted 43 jars. In one corner stood 3 sealed wooden barrels. She pried the lid off the first and found wheat grain dry and clean enough to last one person for months. The second barrel held oats. The third held dried beans. Against the south wall, folded neatly on a stone shelf, were 4 heavy wool blankets and 2 sheepskin pelts. Beside them sat a wooden box containing a handsaw, a draw knife, a brace, and a box of iron nails, a ball of hemp twine, and a sharpening stone. Everything a person would need to repair a shelter and survive a winter. And at the very bottom of the cellar, in the lowest corner, where the foundation stones met the bedrock, Wren found the source of the warmth. Water seeped slowly from a crack in the granite, barely a trickle, warm to the touch. It pooled in a shallow natural basin that had been carved into the rock over centuries of patient erosion and then drained away through another crack deeper in the stone. The water was not hot enough to steam, but it was warm enough to heat the stone around it, and that warmth radiated outward through the cellar walls and upward through the fitted stone floor, keeping the entire underground space at a temperature Wren guessed was somewhere near 58 degrees. Winter or summer, this cellar would hold that temperature. The earth itself was providing heat that no storm could take away. Her mother had found a geothermal seep on a piece of land nobody wanted, and she had spent 5 years building a survival cellar around it. She had dug it by hand, lined it with stone, built shelves, stocked supplies, registered the land, and told no one. Wren opened the toolbox again and looked more carefully. Beneath the sharpening stone wrapped in oilcloth at the very bottom, she found a leather-bound notebook. She sat on the warm stone floor with her back against the wall and opened it. The first half was technical, a work journal, entries in Cora's small, precise handwriting, recording the construction of the cellar from its beginning. The date she started digging, April 1881. The number of stones laid each day. Notes on mortar mixtures, drainage angles, shelf dimensions, hand-drawn diagrams showing the cellar layout measurements marked in pencil that had been erased and redrawn as plans changed. The journal of a woman who was not wandering aimlessly on weekends, but engineering something with the patience and precision of a builder who knew exactly what she was making. But scattered between the technical entries were other lines. Short, personal, written in a different rhythm. One read, "Back has been hurting for 3 days. No one has asked why." Another, "Delphine asked where I go on weekends. I told her I was picking mushrooms. She believed me immediately because she thinks I am not capable of anything more interesting." Wren read that line twice. She heard her mother's voice in it, dry and sharp and undeceived. Then she turned to the last page. The ink was different, darker, written with a heavier hand. A later entry, possibly the last thing Cora ever wrote in this book. Wren, I do not know which winter will come, but I know it will come, and I know you will not run. There is one more thing I have left for you, east side of the property beneath the largest oak. When you are ready, you will find it. The note was signed Cora and dated March 1886. 5 months before she died. Wren sat with the notebook in her lap for a very long time. The lantern flickered. The warm air moved around her like something alive. And she understood finally the thing her mother had been trying to tell her on that summer evening 7 years ago. Cora had not been building something she could not explain. She had been building something she could only explain to one person. And she had waited and worked and said nothing and died before the explanation was needed. But she had left everything in place. Wren climbed back up the ladder and sat on the edge of the open floor with her legs hanging into the cellar, the warm air rising around her, and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry at the funeral. At the funeral, she had been composed because Delphine was watching and because tears in that house had always been judged as weakness. But here alone in the cabin, everyone called worthless above the cellar her mother had built with her bare hands. Wren cried until her chest hurt and her face was swollen and there was nothing left. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and she stood up. She walked outside and stood in the August sunlight and looked at the rutted track leading back to town, back to the general store, back to sweeping floors and stacking shelves and sleeping in the back room Ansel rented to her for $1 a week. It was a small life, but it was safe. She could sell this land, take whatever money it brought, rent a room in town, live quietly. She looked down at her own hands. Small hands calloused across the palms from gripping broom handles. Not strong hands, not builder's hands. But she remembered her mother's hands always covered in dirt, and she remembered the 400 stones in the cellar below each one placed by those hands, and she understood that hands become what you ask them to become. She folded the notebook, put it in her coat pocket the same way she had folded the deed the day before, and walked back into the cabin. She had 2.5 months before winter. Within a week, Wren had quit her job at the general store and moved to the cabin full-time. Emmett Langford showed up on the third day. He lived 3 miles south on a small farm. He had worked alone since his wife died, a quiet man in his 60s with heavy hands and a face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of patient endurance. He had known Cora. When Wren told him what she had found beneath the floor, he did not express surprise. He simply nodded and said, "Cora was always the smartest person in any room she walked into. The trouble was nobody else in the room ever noticed." He became her teacher. He took her to the creek bed on the west side of her property and showed her how to identify limestone by pouring vinegar on it. If the stone fizzed, it was limestone. He taught her to burn limestone in a hot fire overnight until it became quickite calcium oxide, chalky and dangerous. Then mix it with river sand and water to make morite that would harden between the field stones and seal the cabin walls against wind and rain. He said, "Your mother asked me this exact same thing 10 years ago. She learned it in one lesson. You are like her that way." Then he said something else quieter, looking at the ground. "I owe your mother a debt I never repaid. Winter of '78, she kept me from doing the most foolish thing a man can do." He did not explain further, and Wren did not ask because Emmett was the kind of man whose silences were not empty but full, and she sensed that the story would come when it was ready, not before. But the question stayed with her. She spent the rest of August repairing the roof, pulling off the rotted cedar shakes one by one, and splitting new ones from cedar logs she felled on her own property. Emmett showed her the technique: set the froe against the grain, strike with the mallet, let the wood speak. Good cedar splits clean, bad cedar fights you. By the end of the first day, her shoulders burned and her palms were bleeding. But she had 40 new shakes drying in the sun, and the satisfaction of that small pile was worth more than anything she had ever earned sweeping floors. The work taught her things no one had ever told her. She learned that green cedar splits easier than dry, but shrinks as it seasons, so you cut the shakes a 1/4 inch wider than you need and let the Michigan air do the rest. She learned that a roof sheds water not because of the individual shakes, but because of the overlap, each one covering the nail holes of the one below it, so that rain runs down the surface without finding a way through. It was a system, not a collection of parts. And she understood, kneeling on that roof in the August heat with tar on her knees and splinters in her palms, that her mother had understood systems. The cellar below was not a hole in the ground with supplies in it. It was a system. Water provided heat preserved food sustained life, and life was the whole point. She also learned her own body. She learned which muscles failed first and which held longest. She learned that hunger sharpened her focus in the morning, but dulled it afternoon. She learned that the ache in her lower back meant she was lifting wrong, and that the ache in her shoulders meant she was getting stronger. By the end of August, she could swing the froe for 6 hours without stopping, and the blisters on her hands had hardened into calluses that would not soften again for the rest of her life. The confrontation with Ansel came sooner than she expected. When Wren told him she was quitting, Ansel leaned against the counter of his store and looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating an investment. "You are leaving a paying job to go live in a pile of rocks. Your mother was peculiar, Wren, but I did not think you were." Wren said, "Do not talk about my mother." Ansel changed his tone, colder now, transactional. "You borrowed my mule and cart 3 times. That was not charity. That was credit. I will send you an invoice." Wren said she would pay him. Ansel asked with what. Wren had no answer because she did not have one yet, and she walked out of the store without looking back. A week later, on her last trip to town for iron nails and lamp oil, Reverend Colton Welford stopped her outside the church. He was a man of 45 with clean hands and a voice that had been trained to sound compassionate whether he felt compassion or not. He said Delphine had spoken with him. He said the family was concerned about Wren living alone in the woods. He suggested gently that she might consider selling the property and returning to town where a young woman ought to be. Wren looked at him and said, "Did you come up with that concern yourself, or did Delphine ask you to be concerned on her behalf?" Welford did not deny it. Wren said, "If you want to help me, Reverend, pray for a mild winter. My land is my business." She bought her nails, paid in cash, and walked out without looking back. She never had another conversation with Reverend Colton Welford, and she never forgot the way his face had changed when she asked whether Delphine had sent him. But she understood now that Delphine and Ansel and Welford were not three separate problems. They were one problem with three faces. Delphine was watching the property. Ansel was calculating its value. And Welford was providing the moral cover for whatever they intended to do. Wren did not know what that was yet, but she knew the shape of it, and she filed it away quietly, patiently, the way her mother had filed away every piece of knowledge she gathered, waiting for the moment when it would matter. She walked back to the cabin that afternoon through 4 miles of forest, carrying 5 pounds of iron nails in a canvas sack over her shoulder, and thought about the 3 people who wanted her to fail. It was a strange kind of motivation, knowing that people were waiting for you to collapse. Not enemies in any dramatic sense, not people who wished her physical harm, but people who had decided she was incapable and were investing their time and attention in being proved right. Delphine needed Wren to fail because Wren's success would mean that Cora's judgment had been correct, and Delphine could not afford for Cora to be correct. Ansel needed Wren to fail because her failure would convert property into profit, which was the only transformation he understood. And Welford needed Wren to fail because the order of his world depended on people staying in the categories assigned to them, and a young woman living alone in the woods, building something no one could see, was a violation of every category he maintained. Wren was not angry about any of this. She was too busy to be angry. Anger is a luxury for people who have time to sit with it, and Wren had a roof to finish, and a cellar to stock, and a winter to survive. She shifted the nail sack to her other shoulder and kept walking. Through September, Wren rebuilt. She remortared every gap in the upper walls, mixing the lime and sand the way Emmett had shown her, pressing the paste between the fieldstones with a flat trowel she had fashioned from a piece of tin. The work was slow and repetitive, the kind of labor that empties the mind and fills the hands, and Wren found that she needed both. In the evenings, she sat on the cabin step and watched the light drain from the sky through the birch canopy, and she thought about what her life had been 3 months ago: a cot in the back of a general store, a broom $1 a week. She could not believe she had accepted that. She could not believe she had not known there was anything else. One evening in late September, a doe and her fawn walked through the clearing in front of the cabin. They stopped and looked at Wren with the cautious attention of animals that have not yet learned to fear a particular place. The fawn was still spotted, still young enough to stay close to its mother's flank. They stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, the 3 of them, woman and deer, regarding each other across the cooling air. Then the doe turned and walked into the forest, and the fawn followed, and Wren sat on the step and felt a kind of peace she had no name for. She was part of this place now. The land was beginning to know her. Through October, she fortified. She built new floorboards for the cabin, strong ones of oak plank, and constructed the trap door with iron hinges and a recessed ring pole so the cellar entrance sat flush with the floor. She improved the cellar itself, adding shelving, building the bed frame against the warmest wall, installing the secondary stove with its pipe routed up through the floor. She cut and split 4 cords of firewood and stacked them against the north wall under a lean-to she built from cedar poles and bark. And on the last night of October, with the cabin above sealed tight and the cellar below fully stocked, and the first cold winds beginning to whisper through the birch forest, Wren descended the ladder for the night. She had built a bed frame against the warmest wall, a simple rope construction that Emmett helped her design. She had hung lanterns from iron hooks in the ceiling beams. She had added more shelving for the additional supplies she had preserved through autumn, more jars of vegetables, smoked rabbit and grouse, hanging from wooden pegs, dried herbs and bundles from the ceiling. The tiny secondary stove she had installed glowed with a low fire, its pipe routed up through the floor and into the main stovepipe above. She lay down on the sheepskin with the warmth of the earth rising through the stone around her and opened her mother's notebook to the last page. "You will not run." She read the words again, not as a comfort, as a contract. Then she turned back through the pages and found an entry she had overlooked before. June 12, 1884. Laid the 400th stone today. My back says stop, my hands say keep going. Wren looked at her own hands in the lantern light. They were not the hands she had brought to this cabin in August. They were cracked and bruised and calloused in new places, and for the first time in her life, they looked like her mother's hands. She closed the notebook, blew out the lantern, and pulled the sheepskin to her chin. The stone walls held the warmth around her like arms. And for the first time since Cora died, Wren Pemberton slept without dreaming. She did not know that the winter approaching was going to be one of the worst in Michigan's recorded history. She did not know that the storms coming off Lake Michigan would bury the northern counties in snow that would not be matched for decades. And she did not know that this cellar built by her mother's hands for one person would not save only her. But the earth knew, and it kept its warmth. The first snow came in early November, light and almost playful, dusting the cedar boughs and melting by noon, as though it had only been testing the ground. But the old-timers in Traverse City said the lake was still warm from summer, holding heat the way a cast-iron pan holds heat long after you pull it from the fire. And when that warmth met the cold air rolling down from Canada, the sky would open in a way that people in lower Michigan could not imagine. Lake effect snow is not weather, it is punishment. Wren was not thinking about punishment. She was thinking about mortar. On the second week of September, she woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming the new cedar roof, and for a moment felt the satisfaction of hearing rain above her and not feeling it on her face. She had earned that sound. Every shake on that roof had been split by her own hands. Then she heard a different sound, water moving where water should not move. She dropped through the trapdoor and descended the ladder and found the cellar floor wet. Not flooded, but wet enough to darken the fitted stones along the east wall. Water was seeping through a crack in the stonework where the east foundation met a shelf of natural bedrock, a seam that Cora had not had time to seal. The rain was finding its way down through the soil and through that gap, and in the lantern light, Wren could see the dark stains spreading slowly across the floor toward the shelves. The jars were safe. Cora had built the shelves high enough that groundwater could not reach them. Wren realized her mother had anticipated this exact failure and compensated for it in the design. Even the mistakes in this cellar had been accounted for. But accounting for a problem and fixing it are not the same thing. Wren spent the next 14 hours bailing water with a bucket, hauling it up the ladder and dumping it outside in the rain. By midnight, her arms shook so badly she could not grip the bucket handle. Her knees were bruised from kneeling on wet stone. Her back seized twice, locking her in a bent position until she pressed her fists into her spine and forced herself straight. At 2 in the morning, she sat in the wet cellar with her back against the wall and her hands hanging between her knees, and for the first time since she had found this place, she thought Delphine was right. This is just a pile of rocks. The thought lasted about 30 seconds. Then she looked up at the shelves and saw those 43 jars glowing in the lantern light. Each one labeled in her mother's handwriting, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, on shelves built high enough to survive exactly this kind of failure. Cora had not merely hoped the water would stay out. She had planned for the day it would come in. Wren stood up. She went to the creek bed in the rain and dug clay with her bare hands, thick blue river clay that clung to her fingers. She mixed it with ash from the cabin stove, the way Emmett had shown her when they worked the mortar. Though this was a different application, not for binding stone to stone, but for sealing stone against water. She packed the clay and ash mixture into the crack along the east wall, pressing it deep with her thumbs, layer after layer, until the seam was filled and the water stopped. It held. And when the rain ended the next afternoon and Wren climbed out into the dripping forest, she looked at her hands covered in clay and ash and felt something shift inside her. Not pride exactly, recognition. She had failed and she had fixed it, and the cellar was better for it. That night, she went down to the cellar and checked every wall, every joint, every seam where stone met stone. She ran her fingers along the mortar lines the way a carpenter runs his hand along a finished surface, feeling for imperfections. She found 2 more spots where the mortar was thin enough to worry about, marked them with charcoal, and added them to her list for the morning. She was becoming her mother. Not in the ways that anyone would notice from the outside, not in appearance or manner or speech, but in the invisible architecture of habit. She was learning to think in terms of failure, not because she expected to fail, but because anticipating failure was the only way to prevent it. Every crack sealed was a disaster averted. Every jar preserved was a day survived. Every stone laid was a promise kept to someone who would never know whether it had been kept or not. She thought about that as she lay in bed that night. Her mother had built this cellar knowing she might never use it herself. Cora had stocked these shelves knowing she might die before the winter they were meant for. She had done the work anyway, not for certainty, for possibility. And Wren understood that this was the deepest form of love she had ever encountered, the kind that does not require the beloved to witness it. Emmett came the following week to help install the iron stove he had hauled from the salvage yard in town. It was a heavy piece of work getting it off the cart and into the cabin and positioned correctly over the spot where the stovepipe needed to go through the repaired roof. They worked in the kind of silence that only exists between 2 people who trust each other's competence, passing tools without asking, anticipating the next step without discussion. It was while they were fitting the stovepipe, Wren holding the lower section steady, while Emmett sealed the joint above, that he told her. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the pipe, at his own hands working the sealant around the joint, and he talked the way men of his generation talked about the things that had nearly destroyed them, quietly without drama, as though reporting facts about someone else. The winter of 1878. His wife Sidoni had died of pneumonia in January. She had been sick for 2 weeks, and Emmett had done everything he knew, which was not enough. And she had died on a Tuesday morning while he was boiling water for tea she would never drink. He buried her himself because the ground was frozen and no one else would come out in the cold to help. It took him 3 days to dig the grave. He broke 2 shovels. After the funeral, such as it was, he drank. Not socially, not in moderation. He drank the way a man drinks when he is trying to dissolve himself. He drank for a month. He stopped feeding the animals. He stopped feeding himself. The farm went silent around him, and he let it go because silence was the only thing that did not hurt. One night in February, he took his rifle and walked into the forest. He did not bring a lantern. He did not bring a coat. He walked north through the snow with the rifle in his hands and the barrel pointed at nothing yet, but the intention already forming the way ice forms on still water, slowly at first and then all at once. Cora Pemberton appeared on the trail. She was alone. It was past midnight. The temperature was well below zero. She had no business being in those woods at that hour, and Emmett never